start. So you're all settled, Naomi, and you're very comfortable chair there?
I am. I'm slightly concerned that I look much paler than you. The white face, I look a bit spectral.
I think it depends on the quality of the camera, doesn't it? So.
I think so. And I think the other thing is as well, is that normally when we do a video conference, it's during the day, isn't it? So
yeah,
the light's totally different when we kind of get used, I think, to seeing each other and other people in daylight. So in the evening, it changes it completely, doesn't it? So
I'm sure there's a reason that all the television presenters have really, really thick makeup on, don't they?
I know. Yes, definitely. That's why I have to remember that for next time.
Yeah.
Don't look quite so pasty. So what that picture behind you looks like a Solway picture.
Well, actually it is. It's a local artist called Lisa Hooper who does things like, now let me get this right, so I don't think it's lino cut, I think it's like lithograph or something like that. But I think she's based over certainly on the coast, and she does a kind of variety of different kind of coastal birds and, you know, different things. So we've also got a picture by her of a gannet, which is really nice as well.
Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I don't feel like I've got very much on my wall.
What's
really.
The picture behind you? Is that a fungi?
It is actually an A to Z of British wildlife. You can't really see it very well from there. But it's the daughter of a friend I used to work with in the northeast, and she's quite a young graphic designer. So I just really liked it because every little item on there. And so there's an acorn and a bluetit and a chanterelle and a doe. A nice little picture, really.
So we have about 30 people logged on so far, but we're just going to give it another few minutes to let people catch up, and then we'll get started. I'm quite looking forward to this. I'm expecting to learn lots about salt that I don't already know about. In fact, I don't really know anything about salt, except to see it on our chips.
I was thinking the other day, it's never a good idea to think too much, is it? But about I used to have a bit of an obsession with salt when I was a teenager, because I lived in the northeast and I came to Cumbria on holiday, I think when I was about 14 with my parents. I was used to going quite a lot anyway. And I remember we did all the sort of usual bits and pieces and walking and stuff, but I think I picked up a leaflet about exploring the west coast of Cumbria, and I had no idea about the west coast of Cumbria, because obviously, you know, a bit of a hidden.
Very different from the northeast.
Yeah. So and it had a little thing about the salt pans, and for some reason I got really obsessed with these salt pans and insisted that we had a day. And I remember we went to the Maryport Maritime Museum, and we went to the Helena Thompson Museum. We went to look for these salt pans, and I just got this interest in these salt pans.
And did you find them?
Well, I can't really remember. I have a feeling that they were in Workington, but they weren't the Cross Canonby salt pans, which obviously are quite well known on the Solway, which obviously aren't far from Maryport. So I'm not actually sure which salt pans they were, but I do vaguely remember some them not being quite basic sort of.
I think that when you see the have you seen the, I think of Britain at Low Tide, when they did the Scape, were in Fife looking at the salt pans there, and they did, on top of the kind of photographs of them, they put some graphics to show you what they would have looked like. And I think that really helps to kind of bring it to life, doesn't it? Because otherwise it's quite hard to imagine what a kind of a bit on the beach would look like when it was actually fully functioning. But
yeah, I think that's the problem really as well, and how the whole thing works, because although it's fairly simple from what I can see, because, you know, it's quite a mechanical process, isn't it? And the other thing that I did when we did the Solway Wetlands project is our archaeological project, which was focused all around Home Cultural Abbey. We went out, and I went out for the day, managed to get out of the office and go out for, I think I either went for 1 day or 2 days, out with the archaeologists and the volunteers to map all of the salt pans on the marsh, like Skimberless Marsh, and going to Newton Marsh. And honestly, it took us absolutely ages because it was so hard. We were falling into creeks and we were absolutely covered.
And presumably there's quite a lot of them as well.
Yeah, and they're quite, you know, they're obviously monastic, so I was quite surprised, and it was just really good going out with a group of people.
That know what they're talking about as well. So that's just after 9:30 now, but we're just going to give it another couple of minutes just to let more people join, because it does take a few minutes sometimes to log on to Zoom, but we'll get started in just 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah.
So I take it that in the Scottish side of the Solway, I don't think that it is or I think there was a connection with Home Cultram Abbey, wasn't there, in the monastic side?
Apparently so. I didn't know anything really about that, but I think, I mean, I'm sure we'll hopefully we'll find out more.
We'll find out.
We don't actually know anything about what much about the content of these talks so far, but I know, like, because Home Cultram was a Cistercian abbey, obviously the Cistercian network was cross-border as well, so there were kind of networks all over the place, really. It's quite interesting. I'm assuming it's connected with that, but I may be wrong.
So we've just got Alan Bell has just put in the chat that he's got a leaflet, Friends of Whitehaven, the Salt Trade. So that sounds interesting. So that's something to,
I wonder if the salt pans were in Whitehaven, that I remember from when I was young.
Maybe.
Maybe Alan will be able to, it's a long time ago, when I was 14.
We can't expect you to remember that far back now.
Exactly, I know. So yeah, there you go. So this is why the chat is good. So it's a good example, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Already using that. So we'll talk a bit more about that in a due. Sorry, if you can hear a growl, I've got a dog asleep next to me. It's growling in its sleep.
Oh, I think he's having a really bad dream or a good dream.
I think she dreams that she's running after rabbits because she's a whippet.
Oh, yeah.
I have to apologise.
Can't hear him.
No, I think it'll stop soon, but I'll give her a prod.
Don't her.
It's quite funny. So, right, somebody else is talking about connections about Home Cultram charters. This is really good.
Okay,
it's worth pointing out that we can save the chat as well. So if lots of people are putting things on the chat and we can't catch up with them because we're chatting and we're thinking about what we're doing next, then we can save the chat. So people who are posting kind of bits and pieces of information, it'd be really good to be able to, we can kind of see what you're posting as well. So a little bit, but we might not catch up with those right till right at the very end. So yeah, that's great.
So we've got quite a few people logged on now, but we'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get started. So I'll start at 6:35.
It's a horrible day as well. I was just thinking, I don't know what it's like on your side.
It's been really stormy,
Yeah.
And in fact, we had a power cut this afternoon, and by the time it came to kind of 3:30, it was so dark without, when the electricity came back on, you realised how dark it had been without the lights. So
I know,
it's been a really dark day.
I can't think of anything better than to just sit somewhere and like learn about something as well when the weather's like this. You can sort of tuck yourself up in your own homes, and all this technology it's quite new to me.
Yeah, it does make a big difference not having to go out to listen to a talk, doesn't it? It's quite nice being able to do it from home, and it definitely makes it more inclusive, that lots more people can actually join, than would otherwise. So it's good from that point of view.
So. All right, well, it is 6:35 now, so do you think we should give it a...
Yeah, I'm going to start, but we also have on the chat, it's a beautiful day in Florida, so...
Florida?
That's just to make us jealous. Thank you very much.
Really Excellent. Oh my goodness.
Okay, so I'm going to kick off. So welcome to the Salt on the Solway webinar. I'm Claire McFarlane, and I'm the Partnership Manager at Solway Firth Partnership. And this is my colleague across the Solway, Naomi Kay, who's the manager at the Solway Coast Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, based in Silloth. And we also have Anna Pollard from the Solway Coast AONB, and she'll be waiting for any questions that you're going to put in, and she'll pick those up from the Q&A function to ask at the end. So normally at this time of year, we would hold a joint conference to celebrate the Solway Firth and the cultural heritage of the marine and coastal environment. But unfortunately, obviously due to COVID-19 restrictions, we're not able to get together in person. But we have taken this opportunity to come together virtually with a series of webinars, and this is the first one, which is about salt making across the Solway. Now, we haven't done this before, so please bear with us as we go through the session, and hopefully the technology will be fine, but we've obviously got to get to grips with it all. And if anybody wants to know anything else about our organisation, Solway Firth Partnership or the Solway Coast AONB, then just please visit our websites, and you can see some of the projects that we've been working on and the resources that we have. We've got lots of great images about the Solway, so you can feel free to have a look. And finally, we have been kindly donated by the author a copy of Anne Lingard's new book, The Fresh and the Salt, which is this one here. And this is a fascinating book all about the Solway Firth, it's been recently released by Berlin Limited, and we have put all the names of attendees into a prize draw, and we'll announce the winner at the end of this session. So now I'll hand you over to Naomi.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk through, we will move on quickly. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the sort of ins and outs of just this session. I'm sure some of you see already are familiar with how they work, but we're running this session on a webinar function on Zoom. So this means as participants, your camera and video are automatically switched off when you join, so in case you're wondering about that. However, you can still participate. We've got a chat function on your screen, which some people are using already, which is great. You can post comments and observations to everybody on the webinar. So please feel free to use this. All you do is click on it and it brings up a little window and you can type into it. The only tip that I would give is if you're posting a comment, make sure that you select the option all panelists and attendees rather than all panelists. Or your comments won't be seen by everyone. So I've made that mistake before. So if you made a comment, it'd be good for everyone to see it. And we've also got a questions and answers option, which you can find on your screen in the same section. If you have questions for the speakers, which I hope you will have, please post those in the Q&A section. So some of these will be chosen and answered at the end by Anna, who was moderating the Q&A section. So just, if you've got a question, stick it on the Q&A section, and that's the one that we're going to pick up at the end. So please do that. And a final note is that this session is being recorded, and it will be available in due course, hopefully fairly soon, on both the Solway Firth Partnership and the AONB YouTube channels. So you have got a chance to see it again. We were oversubscribed for this session, which is absolutely brilliant news, but it's not good news for people who can't come along. So it's great that we're able to, for people to see this afterwards. And so it leads me now to introduce our two speakers. So we have two for the price of one, which is lovely. We've got Andrew Fielding, who is an archaeologist with a long connection with the AONB and the history of salt making. Before moving to Cumbria, he worked to restore the Lion Saltworks, which is the last family-operated open-pan saltworks in Cheshire that closed in 1886 and is now restored as an industrial museum. He participated in an EU-funded project with Bournemouth University to link traditional salina sites along the Atlantic coast of Europe, multiple countries. He also co-authored the Shire book, The Salt Industry, and founded EcoSal UK, which is a not-for-profit body to research, interpret and promote historic salt making in the UK. Our second speaker is John Pickin, who has a background in museums and archaeology in many parts of the UK and recently retired as curator of Stranraer Museum on the north side of the Solway from Galloway. Since retirement, he's been working as a freelance archaeologist and has been working on several projects, including a community archaeology field survey with a Coniston copper project in the Lake District, so on our side. Sounds really interesting. He has a particular interest in the archaeology of prehistoric metal mining, and he's an active member of the Early Mines Research Group, which is currently involved with an investigation of Bronze Age copper mines in mid-Wales. So we're going to start with Andrew first, who'll do his section of his talk, then we'll hand over to John after that. So I'm now going to hand over to Andrew and hopefully let him switch on his sound and camera before we disappear.
Excellent. Yes, thank you very much, Naomi. Thank you very much indeed. I share my screen. So this short presentation is an introduction to salt making sites on the Solway, and I'm going to be talking about sites along the coast from Whitehaven to Carlisle before handing over to John Pickin, who will talk about the sites on the Scottish side of the Solway. Salt making processes are common all around the world, but each region and each location has its own individual story to tell. And we can start our story with William Brownrigg, who was born in Plumland in Cumberland, and he trained as a doctor and spent time in Leiden in 1733 before coming back to his native Cumberland, where he set up a practice in Whitehaven and worked for Sir James Lowther. As a scientist, he wrote papers on mining and a significant paper to help improve salt making and develop it, basing it on suggestions by John Collins, who published Salt and Fishery in 1682, and also his contemporary Thomas Lowndes in Cheshire. Given that the present talk we're giving is a webinar due to the coronavirus pandemic, it's worth drawing your attention to his paper of 1771 entitled Considerations on the Means of Preventing the Communication of Pestilential Contagion and of Eradicating it in Infected Places. It was written during an outbreak of typhus in Whitehaven, where he was treating many patients. Unfortunately, a national outbreak didn't materialise, but he made many suggestions for limiting transmissions of the disease, including cutting off all communication between places, persons and things that are infected from those that are free of contagion, and that subsistence and essential items should be provided to those infected, all at the public expense, and that local militias should check that people had proper bills of health to be able to pass between counties, even suggesting that it should be policed by local militia, and that by carrying out these local lockdowns, a national lockdown could be avoided. So, having provided you with COVID-19 safety advice based on advice that was given 249 years ago, we'll move on to what he wrote about the art of making common salt, in which he described 6 ways in which salt could be made, and 4 of them are actually used on the Solway. All required that seawater or brine was to become a saturated solution before it was crystallized into white salt. And as seawater is only 2% salt, you need to increase the saturation to 24% before the point at which crystals will form. His first method was to boil seawater directly. The second was to take it from natural brine springs or rock salt, which is where it occurs in places like Cheshire and Brownrigg. The third was to use a partial solar process of using the sun to strengthen seawater before it's boiled to make white salt. And that isn't really used here because we didn't have strong enough sunshine to make that work. The sand washing process, though, was used here, and that extracts salt from dried sands or silt to make a strong brine that can then be boiled. His fifth process was a salt refinery process, dissolving rock salt in seawater or fresh water so that that can then be boiled to make white salt. And his sixth process was a salt on salt process, where salt that's imported from the bay areas of Portugal and France and Spain is dissolved in seawater, where again it's boiled to make white salt. He included some illustrations of salt works. However, the one that we've used in our poster is, he describes this as how salt used to be made. And this is in actual fact based upon a wood engraving of Georgius Agricola that was published in 1556. So that's unlikely to be the type of works that we will find on the Solway. But it turns up in all kinds of publications, and it's almost become a cipher for how salt used to be made. Over the centuries, though, salt pans grew in size from ceramic pans to lead pans and then to iron pans. And the size of lead pans was dictated by the weight that they obviously weighed, being made of lead. These were generally adopted in the Roman period, but continued into the 16th century. And again, we use those on the Solway. Original lead pans are rarely found because obviously the metal could be recycled. The 3 that I've shown here were actually found in a farmer's field between Middlewich and Northwich in Cheshire. However, in 1588 at Newton-Arlish, on the northern, after the church decayed following the dissolution of the monasteries, the lead from the roof was actually taken down and melted to make it into salt pans for people that had rights to make salt there. Iron became more popular as coal replaced peat and wood as a fuel. And initially their size reflected the size of lead pans that they replaced, especially in the Cheshire areas, where the rights to make salt was set by the number of leads that you could actually evaporate. And the illustration here is from William Jackson in 1669, which Brownrigg redraws for his publication, The Art of Salt Making. But his main contribution is to try and redesign how 18th century salt pans should look. And this is a set of architect's drawings showing new designs for salt pans, more energy efficient furnaces, and a wall to separate the firing area from the actual salt making area. Cheshire pans, however, became much bigger as they developed into the 19th century. This is an artist's impression of a family working a salt pan in the Cheshire works. And the one on the right are how large, not just the pans, but the salt works grew in the Cheshire area and in Droitwich and in Staffordshire. This is 1928, and it's quite easy to see how the economic advantages mean that Cheshire salt making gradually replaced salt making all around the coast. So we're going to start our journey this evening in the south at Whitehaven, look at Whitehaven Pier, and then look at the Bank End works and Cross Canonby sites on Allenby Bay. There is a salt refinery site at Lees Bank in Silloth, and then we'll finish up with the Saltcote works associated with Holmcoultron Abbey. The Whitehaven Pier works were actually published, the accounts were published by Blake Tyson in 1999, and he thought that he'd identified some brickwork within the old pier that might have been used as something that they called a salt chamber as the salt works decayed. But there are other works at the back of the old pier which were gradually, they were closed down and built over. The same document that little model plan was drawn from was a design sent by Roland Jackson to Sir Christopher Lowther in 1631, in which he puts a layout, schematic scheme for how one of these salt pans might have been constructed. Christopher Lowther was in Dublin at the time, so presumably the letter was sent to advise him as to what his works that he was going to pay for might look like. And I put some colour coding here because it defines the salt pans, which are in dark pink, and then there's a brine tank for storing the seawater. There's also, in a pale pink colour, there's a store for bay salt. So to make a salt on salt process by mixing the seawater with in the cisterns that are coloured green and then distributing by pipes. And I've been taking a number of works from this period and making 3D models so that we can see exactly whether or not these plans could be turned into working salt works, and then try and define exactly how they were operated. You can see the blue brine tank here. You can see the green cistern tanks. Seawater is pumped up to the middle tank, mixed with bay salt, which drops down into the lower tank before being pumped back up to be distributed by gravity. And around all of that would be the saltworks building with the warehouses on either side of the salt pans. But it makes it much clearer to understand how these works might have operated. If we move north now, this is a map drawn by Andrew Pelling in 1699. And again, I put some colour markers on here because it shows the Netherhall salt works that are marked in yellow and Mr. Lamplew's salt pans that I've shown in the blue square. But also importantly are the little circles that are set back from the foreshore. And these are the collieries from which the coal was drawn to fire the salt pans. Collieries were perhaps the initiation for why these salt works were constructed, because you only needed cheap coal to evaporate salt. And if you could sell the cheap coal for a particular purpose, if you didn't have a customer for it, you might just have to kind of throw it away, become a waste product. So you could make the collieries more efficient by providing it this cheap coal to something like a salt works and then selling your expensive coal to people. The Netherhall salt works were actually mentioned in the joint conference that was held 2 years ago, because Citizen ran a training day school on the site, taking volunteers and teaching them how to record things on the foreshore. I'd hoped that I might be able to put a plan in here, but unfortunately, because of COVID restrictions, Citizen couldn't actually pull out the plans that they produced from their storerooms. But with all the changes in the foreshore, this is a site that's well worth revisiting in the future. Just north of that, the Cross Canonby works was also known as Lamplug's works or the Allenby salt pans. The large circular feature that's situated on the seaward side of the road is its most prominent monument within the landscape. But many might remember there being a caravan site located here until it was washed away by a storm in March 1966. And that bad weather meant that there were plans put in place to try and protect the scheduled monument. And in 1985, an excavation was done by a job creation scheme looking at the salt pans, but also the associated houses. There was a well, and they consolidated the footings of the salt houses. But unfortunately, when the cycleway was put through quite recently, it really kind of separated once again these salt houses from the salt pans, and they've gradually become overgrown by nature in subsequent years. But in 1995, the Ironbridge Institute carried out a survey and some documentary research and produced a management plan prior to the installation of the protected gabions to prevent further coastal erosion. And their survey located some timber structures out in the foreshore suggesting that they were used to provide the brine to the circular salt pans within the site. And their interpretation of that structure was that it was a possible tower that actually pumped the brine up and allowed it to flow down into the salt pans. But recently, further erosion and movement of the sand has revealed pipe structures that seem to have connected these semicircular cutouts that there are on one side of this timber structure. And in March this year, a second pipe was discovered about 30 metres to the north. And you can see how it runs up to an area just behind my dog there, that there would have been the brine tank. Looking back from the salt pan, just to orientate you, the tape measure there is running down to where the pipe would have run. And out to in the foreshore, you can see there are now other structures revealed as the sand moves. There's a possible 4-post structure, something like 80 metres out towards the sea, and the far structure has a single post remaining surrounded by boulders, where there's another possible 4-post structure. And there's a reconstruction here showing the possible way in which this structure links together wooden pipes. And you could possibly interpret this as something like a manhole cover or an inspection hatch sunk down into the sand so that you could unblock any of the pipes if they became fouled up. And the interpretation here, therefore, suggests that rather than there being an overhead delivery of brine, that the seawater was brought from somewhere out to sea, underneath the sand, and fills up the brine well within the salt pans itself. And that this might well be the 2 salt pans and water sumps that are described in a lease of Frances Barwise, the wife of the original owner and the constructor of these salt pans, that had water sumps and swaths and appurtenances for bringing the brine to the salt pans. And again, alongside all the erosion that revealed the second pipe, there's been further erosion behind the gabions, and the council are currently putting in place plans to try and protect the road and the services that have been washed out the road alongside the B5300. Looking at another site that's been lost to us, Lees Bank Saltworks only operated for about 10 years. And it's associated with the construction of the docks and the harbours at Silloth, and also with the construction of the Carrickfergus rock salt mine, because the salt that was brought in to become part of the refining process didn't come from Cheshire, it came from Ireland. And Home Cuthbert History Group have published some photographs of the original chimney for that salt pan and some salt workers' cottages. And looking at the census returns, we can see that Matthew Mann and Twentyman Watson, who were the manager and one of the salt workers there, 10 years after the works opened, they had to find alternative employment within the shipping industry or as agricultural labourers. And that site is just south of the convalescent home and is now being kind of submerged by the shifting sand dunes of the area. East of Silla, big mix of sites, saltcoat sites associated with Holmcoldtram Abbey. And the 2013 and 14 survey as part of the Solway Wetlands project identified about 58 sites in this area that were features recording subcircular pools and pits, many with surrounding banks with inlets and outlets for water, and a total of 24 features were interpreted as brine pits. And the survey also recorded 9 sandstone clapper bridges, with 2 in situ complete ones that enabled people to cross the drainage channels across the marsh. And a further bridge was surveyed at Wedham Flow, a raised peat block, which is known to have been the fuel source for brine evaporation by Holmcoldtram Abbey. All these features lie at the head of the marsh, and further work after this stage 1 survey is required to try and identify the subtle changes in geography and show what relationship they actually have with the head of the marsh. In fact, what salt making processes were actually carried on there. By way of comparison, I pulled up some slides from an excavation in South Lincolnshire in the Wash area, and a whole cluster of 11th, 12th century salt pans lie inside some 2 or many miles inland. But the plan on the right shows the tidal inlets where the Wash came much further inland. And the coastal geography here would be very much like the Morecambe Bay area. Excavation was carried out here in 1968 at Bickerhaven, and this was the first medieval site that was excavated and fully recorded in Britain that had one of these early medieval salt making sites. And it was complemented later by the discovery of filtration complexes for sleeching at Wainfleet St Mary. And I'll show you a picture of that in a moment, but a description of the way in which these filtration units were used is described by John Pickin in 1612, where he says that country people gathered up sand within the floodmark and brought it to the land, and that they cast the sand into certain devices, causing water to run through the sand into a hollow pit made to receive the water, and that the salt water was then boiled in little vessels of lead. And the excavations by McElvoy at Wainfleet St Mary found many of these devices in which the salt sand was put into a box lined with peat and straw, and as you washed the salt out of the sand, the brine liquor was collected into an underground clay pit. Now, in a paper given by Richard Sharp in Carlisle in 2005 called in Cumbria 1092 to 1136, he speculated that peasant settlers were sent by William Rufus from South Lincolnshire and they settled around Carlisle. And he linked them to lands around Spalding, close to the Bickerhaven site, that was under the control of Lucy, daughter and heiress of Theobald of Lincoln. And she was then married to Ivo Talbois and Ralph Miskin. And perhaps some of these workers that they brought up from Lincolnshire were the original salt makers of the salt coats on Solway. Brownrigg also describes the sleeching process, and he links that to the extensive works at Mont Saint-Michel. And it's this area of Normandy that Hugh of Avranches comes from, who becomes the Norman Earl at Chester, another salt-making area. But he says that this kind of process was carried on at Wywater and Meathop in Lancashire and Milnthorpe in Westmoreland and at Ulverston. And he describes how the topography of the high tides enabled it to only be covered at high spring tides, so that the salt could crystallize out in the sand, and that sand could be collected to make strong brine. And I'd recommend that if you're on holiday in that area, to go and visit the Ecomusée de la Baie de Mont Saint-Michel, because they have a working example of a salt coat, and they do demonstrations of collecting the sand and washing it to get the salt crystals out, and then evaporating that in lead salt pans. And you can see the three here that are based on a 19th century engraving look identical to the three salt pans that I showed you earlier from Cheshire. And the geography of the Solway and the geography of Morecambe Bay is quite different to the Atlantic Irish Sea facing coasts at Allonby Bay and at Whitehaven. And we can see on the left the difference between the tidal range and the tidal flow patterns at Allonby on the left-hand side of the graph, and the tidal range and the flows at the River Esk at Redkirk Point. And the configuration of the Solway is constricted east of Bowness. It's the phenomena that cause the tidal bores. And we can see that that allows a greater amount of time for the sands to dry out during low water, and then be dissolved as the tide comes in at high tide. And as the flat sand is receiving the tide as it comes in, it dissolves the salt that's within the mudflats and creates a hypersaline solution that gets pushed up into the top head areas of the marsh, which is where all the salt pans are, particularly in Morecambe Bay. And finally, just when we think that we understand the sand wash process, and we've been to the museum at Mont Saint-Michel, I'll just introduce you to a different method of separating the salt from the sand, one described by John Collins in his Salt and Fishery book of 1682, where instead of relying on the tide to come and wet the foreshore, you collect the seawater and scatter it over a field of salt. On the left, there's a working example at an environmental centre within Japan, where this process was used. But you then scatter the salt over that sand, you rake it to increase the surface area, and then you wash the salt that's created out of the sand to create your fresh brine. Whichever of these two processes were used within the Solway, the head of the Solway, the sands of the Solway, sand washing continued there into the medieval period and right the way up till the 19th century. It was even adjudicated upon in the courts as people making small quantities of salt at Priestside and Cockville claimed relief from paying the salt tax upon their produce. So as we've now crossed over to the northern part of the Solway, I think it's an appropriate time for me to hand over this talk to John Pickin, who'll tell you more about how salt was made on that side of the Solway.
Aha, we have the technology. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, well, I'd like to look at the archaeological evidence for salt production on the north side, the Scottish side of the Solway. Unlike Cumbria, salt was never a significant role in the history of Dumfries and Galloway.
You want to listen?
Yeah.
But salt making was an interesting if small rural industry, and it just left us with an important and sometimes enigmatic archaeological legacy. Now, bear with me a sec. Here we go. Yeah, we don't really know when salt production began on the north side of the Solway. The earliest recorded dates we have are from the 1170s, when Uchtred, Lord of Galloway, had salt coats or salt-making sites at Colvend and New Abbey on the Cumbria coast. And by around 1200, William de Bruce, Lord of Annandale, was operating salt coats at Rain Patrick, that's the modern Redkirk Point, over near Gretna. By the early 13th century, many of these salt-making sites had been given by local landowners to a number of religious houses. And as we just heard from Andrew, Home Cultrum acquired the salt coats at Colvend, Preston, and New Abbey in Cumbria, which were all managed through the Abbey's Scottish Grange at Gugunion, near Dalbeattie. St. Bees was also granted Scottish salt coats at Colvend and Preston, and both houses were making salt at Redkirk Point in the Inner Solway. Melrose Abbey was also similarly involved with Solway salt making, and it too had salt coats at Colvend and Redkirk. Now, Melrose is the only Scottish abbey known to have had an interest in Solway salt. In some ways, this is quite surprising, especially given the large numbers of religious houses in medieval Dumfries and Galloway. But unlike in England, very few charters from Scottish abbeys have survived. We just don't know if any of the local religious houses were actually involved in salt production. Similarly, we have no idea of the scale of lay involvement. The known medieval salt coats are all along the Cumbria coast and near Annan. But further west, the extensive salt marshes at the head of Wigtown Bay would have been ideal for early salt making. And the area is also close to the monastic houses at Whithorn, Glenluce and Sulseat. Now, Wigtown Bay would really benefit from a detailed archaeological survey, and I think there's good potential here for discovering medieval salt coats. So what survives of the medieval salt-making industry in Dumfries and Galloway? Are there any archaeological remains from this period in the area? So we're lucky that about 15 years ago, David Cranston from Cranston Consultancy carried out a rapid archaeological survey on both sides of the Solway, and he identified a number of early salt-making sites. Probably the best preserved remains on the Scottish side are here at Calabric, south of Dumfries. On the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust Reserve is an area with a telltale place name, Saltcote Hills. And here on the edge of the backlands, above the salt marsh, are a series of distinctive long, low mounds, the waste material left after sleaching for salt. Sleaching, as Andrew has just described, was a method of washing sand to obtain salt-rich brine. The mounds at Calabric are easy to spot, and the bird observation tower has been built directly onto the most easterly of the sleaching mounds. And this view, looking out towards the coast and with the observation tower on the left, gives some idea of the size and appearance of these Saltcote Hill sleaching mounds. Distinctive features in an otherwise flat landscape, these mounds are the best surviving examples in the Solway area. Interestingly, there is no documentary evidence for this site, but the place name Saltcote is a good indication of a medieval date. Two more views here of the Saltcote Hills sleaching mounds. The image on the right shows a rectangular hollow on one of the mounds. That's this thing here. This may be a reservoir or kinch where salt water was stored, or it could even be the foundations of one of the Saltcote buildings where salt-rich brine produced by sleaching was evaporated by being heated in lead pans. And we know from some of the few surviving medieval records that the salterns, the saltcoats in the inner Solway used peat as their fuel, whilst those around New Abbey and Colvend used timber. Collaborate was probably peat fueled. And this final slide of the Saltcote Hills shows a small sleeching mound, here we are, that's been cut through by a modern farmer track. The mound, as you can see, is composed of a distinctive stone-free silt. Features like this can be so easily destroyed, and it is remarkable that this and other mounds at Collaborate still survive in comparatively good condition. Elsewhere in the area, sleeching mounds have been damaged or destroyed by development and by land improvement. Other saltcote sites, medieval saltcote sites, have been lost to coastal erosion. The saltcotes at Rainpatrick or Redkirk Point near Annan were operated during the 12th century by the monks of Melrose, St. Bees and Home Cultrum, and they were destroyed by coastal erosion. We don't know when this destruction took place, but in 1675, the church that gave Redkirk its name is described as fallen into the sea. The salt-making sites, which must have been nearby, were probably destroyed at a much earlier date. And David Cranston, during his archaeological survey of salt-making sites, searched without success for evidence of a saltcote at New Abbey, and concluded that it too had probably been lost to historic coastal erosion. Well, it seems that local salt making came to an end in the early 1400s. This was probably the result of climate change at the start of the Little Ice Age. Intriguingly, however, salt production using the sleeching method appears to have continued in use, or perhaps was restarted, along the Dumfriesshire coast during the early post-medieval period. Starting in the mid-1600s, and as we've heard from Andrew just now, there are accounts of sand washing or sleeching, or what were called the Annandale Saltworks, a group of salt-making sites located on the coast between Loch Water and the English border. By an Act of Parliament, a Scottish Parliament, made in 1671, the Annandale Saltworks, uniquely in Scotland, were exempt from taxation. And this exemption probably allowed salt working to continue as a small, seasonal craft industry. Local manufacture ceased with the abolition of the salt tax in 1823, an event that opened Scottish salt works to English and foreign competition. Unfortunately, there is little surviving archaeological evidence for the Annandale Saltworks, especially in the Ruthwell area, which we know was the centre of 18th century production. There is, however, pardon me, an unusual site situated on the Sark Foot salt marsh, a few hundred metres east of the River Sark, which here forms the border between England and Wales, England and Scotland. This is another site found by David Cranston. The Sark Foot site comprises a small, isolated sleeching mound, measuring some 30 metres by 50 metres and standing less than 1 metre high. On the top of the mound are a number of sunken features, possibly the remains of water tanks or buildings. The interesting thing is that this site lacks any historical records and was completely unknown before David's survey. Is it the only surviving evidence we have for one of the post-medieval Annandale Saltworks? Well, by the 17th century, nearly all the sites on the Scottish side of the Solway were making salt by boiling seawater. And as Andrew mentioned earlier, in this process, seawater was collected in a tidal reservoir or bucket pot and then taken to a pan house where it was evaporated in an iron pan heated by timber, peat or coal. The salt tax returns and evidence from place names and historic maps show where these post-medieval salt works were. And as you can see from this slide, the vast majority are way over in the Rins of Galloway. So let's look at the archaeology of these post-medieval saltworks. Often, the only thing that survives is the rock-cut bucket pot where the seawater was stored. A good example can be seen here on the shore at Sandy Hills. There are no surviving records for this salt-making site, but ruined salt pans are marked here on John Ainsley's 1797 map of Cumbria. Of the rest of the salt works, nothing survives. And if you remember those photographs that Andrew showed of the Breton salt works, some of the saltcote houses were fairly ephemeral structures. But the best preserved of the post-medieval saltworks on the Scottish Solway. It's here at Galdenoch on the west coast of the Rins. It's 2 miles from the village of Laswalt and about 8 miles west of Stranraer. Now, this wonderful building is Galdenoch Castle, tower house built in the late 16th century for the local landowning family, the Agnews of Lochnaw. In 1640, the then laird, Uchtred Agnew, made a contract with one of his tenants, Alexander Osborne, to establish a salt works on the coast of Galdenoch. The laird gave Osborne an acre of ground and the right to cut peat for the salt pans. As far as we know, all the salt works in the Rins were fuelled with peat. This is in marked contrast with the salt works on the Scottish east coast and also those on the Cumbrian coast, which use coal and were located close to coal mines. The Galdenoch works themselves are located on the north side of the aptly named Salt Pans Bay, and the archaeology here is quite remarkable. In addition to features associated with the salt works, there are the remains of a small farmhouse, some fields, and encircling a rocky coastal stack here, there are the massive stone ramparts of a late prehistoric fort. And here on this map you can see the outline of the fort. Here are the salt works, and here is the farmhouse, probably built on the site of earlier salt works buildings. The most obvious building at the site is this 2-compartment stone structure, probably built originally as housing for the salt workers. It was described in 1791 as the 2 dwellings of the salt pans, valued at £2 sterling. Salt production here may have been a seasonal industry, the tenants combining salt production and peat cutting with subsistence farming, and some of the small boulder-walled fields enclosing areas of lazy bed cultivation can still be seen. In 1688, the tenant operating the Logan Salt Works, also in the Rins of Galloway, had the right to remove 3,000 loads of peat a year for his salt pans. I'm assuming that the term load refers here to a cart load. This is a huge amount of peat, and similar quantities must have been used at Galdenoch. The extensive peat deposits of the Rins may be one of the reasons for the concentration of salt works in this area. And here is a quick picture of the pan house. It survives as a raised rectangular earthwork and appears to be divided into 2 separate spaces, one for the salt pan itself and the other as a fuel store and working area. In 1791, the lease for Galdenoch mentions a pan house, a peat house, and what is described as a large hole digged in the rock. This is the bucket pot, and it still survives as a rock cut feature just below the high tide mark. Galdenoch appears to have been the longest lived of the Rins peat-fired salt works, and production continued into the early years of the 19th century, perhaps surviving until the 1820s and the abolition of the salt tax. About 1 mile south of Galdenoch is the little known but intriguing site of Drumwisley. Perched directly on the edge of the cliff is a large rectangular stone building. Nearby are the remains of a small store-like building and the foundations down here of a turf-walled structure. The site, which has been interpreted as a small farmstead, is shown as a ruin on the first edition Ordnance Survey map of 1849. The main building, built on the lip of a cliff, is in a bizarre position for a farmhouse, and would have been open to the worst of the storms blowing in from the North Channel. But it is the perfect site for a small salt works, and there's a natural tidal bucket pot at the base of the cliffs. The floor of one of the 2 rooms of the building is about 1 metre higher than the other, and has traces of a subfloor channel or flue. This would be a very unusual feature in a farmhouse, but makes sense if the raised compartment is actually a pan house. So I wonder if Drumwisley is a previously unrecognised salt works. There has been very little investigation of the salt industry in the Rins, and further archaeological survey in this area could produce some very interesting results. So I'd like to finish this section by looking at the Rascarroll salt works, surveyed last year by volunteers from Scape. This part of the Cumbria coast was the scene of a number of small industrial enterprises, including coal and copper mining, stone quarrying, and millstone making. And tax records show there was a salt works here in 1716. The archaeological evidence for the salt works is a semicircular boulder wall created to create a large bucket pot or tidal reservoir. Nothing else survives, and it must be assumed that the rest of the salt works have now been destroyed. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all the local salt works had closed by the 1820s. But at Rascarroll, there's an intriguing record that suggests salt production may have continued much later. This map, recently digitised by the Dumfries Archival Mapping Project, is a sketch survey of the estate of Rascarroll, dated 1870. It shows a number of coal mines, or coal shafts, here along the shoreline. But it also marks, close to the site of the surviving bucket pot, a salt pan. Does this mean that salt was still being produced here in the 1870s, some 50 years after the demise of the industry elsewhere on the Scottish side of the Solway? And was it the presence of coastal coal reserves, albeit small, that allowed salt to be made here at such a late date? So I'll finish with some quick thoughts drawn up with Andrew for future work that we could do on Solway salt. Further research, well, there's a real need for targeted field work, especially using LiDAR data to help with site identification. There's also huge scope, I think, for documentary research into the history and economics of Solway salt production. And there's a need too to record and monitor the condition of our salt making sites, many of which, as we've seen again from Andrew's part of the talk, are threatened, directly threatened by coastal erosion. And there is a need too to raise general awareness of the heritage of Solway salt making. So with that, I'll try and close down and pass you back to Anna. Thank you.
Yeah, that was intriguing and revealing, John and Andrew, and has certainly raised some interesting questions from the audience. Do we have Andrew?
Yep, I'm here.
Great. All right, so the first question is from Kim. Is any salt still being produced or harvested on the Solway today?
On the Scottish side, no.
No,
Okay.
not here. Though I have heard that I've had enquiries in the past from a farmer in Dumfries and Galloway who was interested in diversifying part of their farm and making salt. There's a lot of entrepreneurs making salt in other parts of Scotland, Skye, and there are new people coming in. In Ayr, there's actually a brine graduation tower where instead of using ponds to strengthen the brine using the sun, you cascade the seawater down thorn bushes. It's a process that's been used in the continent since the medieval period. But the works that have been set up, you can visit them now, you can buy salt from them, but that is unique in Western Europe, I believe, to actually have a graduation tower that's still making salt.
Oh, great. Next question is from David. How important was salt making to the local economy compared to, say, agriculture or fishing?
I think on the Scottish side, it was very, very low key. It was, just a very small rural industry, and even at its height, probably only employed handfuls of people, no more. I think on the Cumbrian side, it was very different.
I think some local landowners that had knowledge of what other people were doing in other parts of the country, but I think that they were more kind of private ventures rather than proper industrial businesses. People were encouraged during periods at which we were fighting Europe, and there were less ability to import salt from Spain and France. There was people were encouraged to make salt, but once the wars were over and it was easier to import salt from overseas, most people did that rather than go to the effort of making it themselves. And Lowthers, they were trying to get into the Irish market because lots of ships provisioned their overseas voyages in Ireland to try to avoid taxes on cattle and taxes on salt. But he found that he couldn't make his salt as cheaply as they could in Cheshire, and so really eventually just gave up.
Right. So from Christine, is there any evidence of salt making at Bank End or Cross Canonby by the Romans? I always assumed they were medieval.
Yes, they are medieval. We have no early salt making sites that we know of at the moment that are earlier than the medieval period. I think probably because the Roman wall is, because it has the World Heritage Site and everybody thinks the Romans therefore would have been involved in salt making, that they had the best ability to bring salt in from Europe. And most of the Roman salt works are really out in the nicer weather on the east coast and down on the south. Where we looked at the salt making sites around the Wash, there's a huge historical development from the pre-Roman period to from the Iron Age to the Roman period to the medieval that we just don't have here. It's not to say something might not turn up in the future. Steve Sherlock in the Tees Valley has recently uncovered a site that he thinks might be Neolithic, which would be the earliest. It would predate our earliest Bronze Age sites for salt making by 2,000 years. And when he first thought he'd found that, people said, oh, we don't have salt making from that period in this country. You have it in Poland, you have it in Germany, you have it in Spain, but we don't have it in this country. But I think he's right. I think he does have one of the earliest salt making sites. So who knows? If it hasn't been eroded into the sea, perhaps if we do more investigative work on our sites, we might find that there are earlier ones, but at the moment there's no dating evidence.
Great. Has David Cranstone's work been published?
No, it's not. It was, copies of it are with the local HER, the Historic Environment Record in Dumfries. I think there have been Tracy versions of it, but no, it still remains as an unpublished piece of work, unfortunately.
Yeah,
it's a very, very good piece.
And in fact, the other excavated examples that I quoted, the Iron Bridge report that was done for Allerdale Council, the Manpower Services excavations of the salt houses, none of those have been published. They've been praised in some publications by the Solway Coast AONB, but some of them we're using information that's a bit out of date now. Part of the work that I'm trying to do with the grant from the AIA is actually to update and to reinterpret some of those publications and then try and get it out to a wider circulation.
Okay, from Alan, the satellite view of the salt courts at Drigg and Carlton shows a rectangular marking. Is this linked to Calder Abbey?
One for you, John.
So, I thought, can you say again where they were?
Sorry, the salt courts at Drigg and Carlton.
Oh, Drigg and Carlton are on the Cumbrian side, aren't they, I think?
I thought you'd done a bit more on the medieval monastic side.
No, I expressed total ignorance of the Cumbrian side.
Yeah, no, they're not sites that I know too much about either.
No
I think you've got a joint ignorance here. We don't know.
That's good. No problem at all. So Kim, from Kim, has anyone ever looked into recreating some of the methods locally, such as for a living museum demonstration?
No, I did one demonstration for the Solway Wetlands project, but that was for the volunteers that were doing the field walking 3 or 4 years ago. But it's something that I think that we could suggest that we could do in partnership, perhaps on both sides of the Solway, in part of the future work that we were suggesting.
Okay.
I think certainly the sand washing would be very interesting to experiment. Lots of people up and down the country do demonstrations of evaporating seawater or evaporating brine in the Cheshire area, but actually collecting or washing crystallized salt out of sand is something that I don't think anybody's done in this country.
No. And I think that at a local level, we've got such very, very good records of how it was done in the Ruthwell area in the 18th and early 19th century. You can use those to replicate some of these processes. So yeah, I think it's a very good idea. And I would imagine also attract a lot of interest. And if we're talking about this idea of just trying to increase awareness of Solway salt, that'd be a wonderful way to get public involvement.
Okay. From Bruce, given the scope of the Roman settlement of the area on the south coast of the Solway and the importance of the salt to the Romans, is there potential for finding evidence of Roman salt making there?
There may be potential, but I'm not sure. I think that the Romans, they had these good salt making sites in Cheshire, for instance, and on the southeast, and their communications and transport was so good that I think that it's unlikely that within this kind of border frontier they would actually have made it here. I think it was too unsettled.
Okay, great. From Donald Gibson. Oh. Yeah. What was the level of tax imposed on salt produced locally compared with the imported products in the 17th, 16th century?
I think, and I'm going to defer here to Andrew's greater knowledge, I think the Scottish tax was different from the English tax. Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah. In fact, at the Act of Union, salt was something like the 4th point on the agenda for joining England and Scotland together. It was so important, and that was all. I can't tell you offhand what the actual rates are because they do change. But on the Scottish side, lots of things were different. For instance, salt workers working in salt houses were tied to their occupation. So if you became a salt worker, then you worked for the salt master and you weren't allowed to change your trade. You had to work there. The soldiers that were captured at Dunbar and moved down to Durham, some of them were actually taken and moved to making salt on Teesside because that was their trade. And you had to have the special permission to actually leave a salt works in Scotland, whereas England, it was a lot more casual. The accounts that have been published for Whitehaven, for instance, they do give names of people and it does give pay rates, but I don't have those to hand at the moment either. Some of what the taxation did as well was to kind of regularise the cost of production rather than an individual producer selling at whatever price he liked. There was some stability within the system for the consumers as well as the people producing it.
Yeah. I think in Scotland the tax is very much a sort of a protectionist measure after the Union, that by having their own tax rate, then there'd be less incentive for Scotland to be importing salt from elsewhere, especially from England. So it was a preferential rate which encouraged local production. However, a lot of the salt that was produced in Scotland was actually fairly poor quality. And salt for things like preserving fish had to be a higher quality, and that was imported from either England or, more often, the bay salt that Andrew mentioned, coming from continental Europe.
Yeah. And there was also a huge amount of salt works on the east coast of Scotland, and that was actually because markets were stronger in the Baltic. So, and you had a lot of collieries there as well. So you had the fuel, you had the ports, you had the ships, and you had the customers for either salting fish, or you had an overseas market that you could sell it to, which you didn't have. It wasn't as great on the west coast.
No, I think when you're talking about the Scottish salt industry as such, certainly in the post-medieval period, you're talking about the Firth of Forth, the east coast. What was happening in Galloway and Dumfriesshire was almost an aberration. You know, it was a little one-off rural industry and had no effect on the larger Scottish economy at all.
Okay, great. Do you think people would have got lead poisoning from the salt made using lead pans?
Potentially, yes. I've actually made some lead salt pans and made salt in them. We had them the salt tested at British Salt. Part of the byproducts of salt making is there's a lot of calcium carbonates and sulfates within the brine, particularly calcium salts in seawater. And that has a scaling property. Anybody that lives in a hard water area knows that your kettle furs up, you get this calcium deposits on it. That kind of settles and burns itself onto the bottom of the lead salt pan. But eventually, if you let it build up too much, then the lead heats up underneath it and the scale acts as an insulator, and you can run the risk of melting your lead pan. And so you have to chip that scale off, and you release fresh surface of lead for the brine to sit on. The scaling products that we had tested were 1,000 times above the safe limit for lead in food today.
Gosh.
So if you ate enough of it, it wouldn't have done you a lot of good. But then most of the time, the salt that we're talking about wasn't being used for food. It was for preserving fish and meat. And before you ate those products, you would have washed the salt off and cooked it. So it perhaps wouldn't have been as dangerous as perhaps we think it might be.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Thank you very much for your questions. That's all we have time for. So now it's back over to Naomi and Claire for the prize draw.
It's just, well, that final grisly answer really about lead poisoning was a very good one to end on. I don't really know to sum up really. I mean, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much to both of our speakers. It's just been a real treat to have two people talking and being able to kind of like ping pong off each other a little bit as well, really, and give that perspective. I've really enjoyed that. I feel like I kind of need to rewatch it as well, just to kind of pick up all that information. And I think, you know, I suppose, you know, it's amazing to think about the impact that salt has on the landscape on both sides of the Solway, and it's something that we take completely for granted in the way that we liberally throw it in our chips. But you know, that sort of tiny thing, really, that very important thing, had such a sort of an impact on how our landscape's formed. And I found it really interesting to learn a bit more about our side of the Solway, but also think about the north side as well. It's made me want to sort of explore a little bit more into Dumfries and Galloway too, and you know, what different landscapes that we've got on the Solway Firth. It's absolutely great. And another couple of things that came to mind is about, okay, what's the future of salt making? Could we you know, find a way to produce it again as a kind of like a food production kind of tourism economy type of, you know, that's the question to ask really. And I'm pleased somebody actually asked that question first. But also, what do we do about conserving and documenting the remains, because they are on a really, really fragile position. We quite clearly cannot preserve them forever. So we really need to think about some more action and activity around that, whether that's, you know, really, you know, there's obviously more research is needed. So a kind of feeling that this may be the start of another project. Claire, what do you think?
Definitely, yeah, that'd be great.
So it's really, really good food for thought. Thank you. So thank you also to the speakers and the attendees as well. Thank you for sticking with us. And I've really enjoyed the chat as well. I'm sorry I haven't been able to kind of respond to every comment. You know, there's obviously quite a few people I know as well that I haven't been able to kind of say hello to. This isn't the last that you'll hear about Solway salt making. We've got a couple of research and restoration projects in the offing, so really please watch this space, and there's been a couple of requests to continue some of the dialogue as well, so we'll certainly be doing that, and we'll be rereading the chat as well to pick up on some of those comments, so thank you for that. Can I also say thank you to Anna, who was the disembodied voice that came over the questions there. Anna's our project officer, and she's really been doing all of the work to pull all this together and to get you know, to grips with the technology. So massive thanks to Anna. I'm sure it'll get easier from now. We've put in quite a lot of work, particularly with Anna. So thanks. This is the first session. We would love any feedback that you have. If you do have any feedback, positive or negative, well, or constructive, just ping us an email. You can reply to the email address from the link that was sent out. That might be either Anna's directly or the info@Solway Coast AONB, and obviously some of you will have had the information through Solway Firth Partnership. You can also use our social media channels on Facebook or Twitter, and again both SFP and us have got those set up. Our next cross-border coastal conversation, because we want to keep this going really and have one hopefully every month or so, is provisionally booked in for Thursday the 3rd of December. And will be about the historic farm buildings on both shores of the Solway Firth. So it should be really interesting and obviously probably quite topical as well. So please come and join us for that, and watch this space. We'll give you more information about that as well. So please hope you can join us on that. If you have any more ideas for other topics, again, please just let us know as well, and we'll do our best to try to kind of meet demand and interest as well. So there's no point in organising things that you don't want to see. So please do send us your ideas. And I'll hand over to Claire for the prize draw.
Yeah, so now it's time for our very exciting book draw. We asked the author Anne Lingard to choose a number at random between 1 and 100 before the event, and we've matched that number with the names on the list. So we're delighted to announce that the winner is number 48, which was Graham Pollett. And we'll get in touch with Graham and arrange postage of the book and make sure you get that safely. So, and just to finalise, the other event that's coming up soon is next Friday. We have the Solway Firth Partnership AGM, again via video conferencing. So if you're interested in joining us, please visit the Solway Firth Partnership website, and all the details are on then. And finally, as Naomi's already said, I hope you enjoyed the evening and hope you'll join us next time. And normally we'd say have a safe journey home, but actually you're all at home, so you don't need to go anywhere. So we'll just say bye and thanks for joining us.
Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye.